making sure you're surrounded by a team who's at the top.
U.S. officials, intelligence officials, the military are aware of, and that is that he has a very tight circle of advisors that he listens to. He's been increasingly isolated in recent months and years, particularly during the COVID pandemic. You've seen those images of him at the end of very long tables, even as he's meeting with some of his closest advisors, and that lack of people around him who can tell him either different opinions, different analyses, or even hard facts or bad news creates a bad decision-making environment which concerns the U.S. One man with that much power, not necessarily good information, can lead to bad decisions, and that's a principal concern of U.S. officials right now, particularly with all the force that Putin has amassed here now on the ground in Ukraine.
So worrisome indeed. Jim Sciutto in Lviv in Ukraine for us. Jim, thank you very much. Stay safe over there as well. Just ahead, Russia unleashes a deadly new rocket attacks on Ukraine's second largest city coming up. We're going to break down Putin's latest moves and what comes next. Stay with us.
Come on. He's yours now.
We got your car, sweetie.
A dealership? I thought this was an online thing.
I look like 11 miles an hour. We've pretty much melted all the snow, but we got more snow coming back in this weekend. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Here's our temperatures right now. Everybody way above normal. Average high this time of year in Sioux Falls is 37 degrees. We shot right by that during the day today. Of course, made all the way to 62. Now, we do have clouds coming in from the northwest, and it's going to be fairly thick. We'll call it a partly cloudy day for tomorrow. The only place we're really expecting to see any weather is right up here, the northeastern corner of South Dakota. We got a little sliver of energy going to pass through that area after midnight tonight. Could see some sprinkles up there. And we're going to have kind of the same thing on Wednesday night there as well. Whatever we get for any rain or snow this week is not going to be very much until we get to Friday night and Saturday. That's when we have a big system moving in from the southwest. Let's take a look at Futurecast, shall we? Blue is snow, green is rain, and pink's a little something in between. This is 2 a.m. tomorrow. This is, again, the northeastern corner of South Dakota, that area, and it will be below freezing by that time, so.
Ain't that this?
Men's and women's tourneys begin Saturday over at the Premier Center. Here's a look at the men's bracket. Top-seeded SDSU will face Omaha Saturday evening at 6. USD squares off against Kansas City Sunday evening at 6. That could set up a South Dakota showdown on Monday night. The men's championship game is next Tuesday at 8. The women's bracket hasn't quite been decided yet. USD and SDSU have wrapped up the top 2 seeds, but USD's game tonight will determine the final seeding. Regardless of tonight's outcome, both teams are set to play Saturday. USD and SDSU could meet Tuesday for the Summit Championship. A reminder,
as we do in this case, as we do in other cases, that these economic measures will apply pressure on the Russian Federation to ultimately do the right thing, and that is to bring an end to this conflict. Were that to happen, these measures would be calibrated accordingly. If that does not happen, if Russia continues to escalate, these measures will be calibrated accordingly. We are prepared to escalate further. We are also prepared to calibrate in the other direction if these measures have their intended effect.
So the conflict can end, on different terms. So, is that a simple? The conflict ends, the sanctions ends, and because what their and Russians' end goal is. I mean, they want to end this conflict, but on their terms, right?
So I wouldn't want to be quite so categorical. Obviously, there will need to be accountability for what the Russian Federation has done. The fact that it has launched this needless, unprovoked, unjustified war against its neighbor. That is something that the United States, together with the international community, we will need to wrestle with. How best to hold the Russian Federation accountable for that, just as we have continued to hold the Russian Federation accountable for its attempted annexation of Crimea, for its incursion and invasion into the Donbass in 2014, some 8 years ago. what we have seen, and I'll make this point, is that this conflict has already displaced hundreds of thousands of individuals, of people, and resulted in significant civilian casualties. This is a war that threatens to explode even further on urban areas, rendering even more displacement, casualties, loss of civilian life. And civilians, we know, will bear the brunt, especially as this conflict encroaches on civilian population centers and civilian cities. We consider reports of civilian casualties to be credible and in line with Russia's past operations, both in Russia-controlled areas of Ukraine and in conflict areas elsewhere in the world where Russia has been belligerent. The government of Russia and all Russian personnel involved in these operations should know that the United States is supporting an international multilateral effort to detect and document potential human rights abuses or violations of international humanitarian law. And as I was saying before, we are equally committed to supporting the pursuit of accountability for human rights violations, for abuses of international humanitarian law, for potential war crimes, for other potential atrocities, using every tool available, including criminal prosecutions where appropriate. Will?
Yeah, what's the leverage to do anything about the humanitarian situation, or to stop this kind of thing? We've talked about making comments in the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly, or the Security Council, where Russia has a veto. If Russia is willing to escalate this conflict further, do you agree with that, first of all? And second of all, what is the real leverage if Russia can veto these measures and can simply proceed?
Well, I'll make a couple points there. One, Russia cannot veto our efforts, international efforts, multilateral efforts to document and to hold accountable those responsible for violations of human rights and international humanitarian law. This could be at the political level, it could be at the operational level, and together with our partners, we will assemble everything we can to hold these individuals to account, whether that form is criminal or in any other context. What I will also say on the humanitarian front is that the United States continues to be the single largest provider of humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. This was one of the many measures that you heard from us in recent hours. It was yesterday that we announced $54 million in additional humanitarian assistance to Ukraine to help the people of Ukraine. That is in addition to $52 million that we have provided to Ukrainians in Ukraine over the past year. And as the humanitarian needs of our Ukrainian partners increase, we will be prepared to work with the international community to do more. We're working closely with the UN, we're working closely with NGOs and aid organizations on the ground. As you know, our humanitarian assistance goes to our partners who are on the ground, and we've been in regular contact with our humanitarian partner providers. Many of them are still able to conduct their life-saving work inside of Ukraine, and we're continuing to fund them, as are so many of our allies and partners around the world. So Moscow can be obstructionist in some ways. Moscow can politically stand in the way, but Moscow would have a hard time standing in the way of this work, and Moscow won't be able to stand in the way of the accountability to which we're committed.
What specific things are you worried about?
Chances. The UK's best kept skincare secret.
No.
We're extending this special offer.
If you're active military, well, he's banned from traveling for personal reasons. Any of his assets in the Western financial system will be frozen. And the same goes for oligarchs that we're putting on our sanctions list. You know, one of the announcements we put out on Saturday, Ari, was that we're going to begin a multilateral process of finding the yachts, the fancy cars, the private jets, of all of the oligarchs that have benefited from kleptocracy in Russia. And we're going to begin seizing them. And we think over time, that's going to hit those most close to Putin, and perhaps even Putin himself.
Deputy National Security Advisor for these economic issues for President Biden. Dalip Singh, thank you for making time for us as you're working late tonight. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Ari.
Absolutely. Coming up, General McCaffrey will be here to get into depth about these military aspects of the pressure on Ukraine. What can they withstand? Later, there's been reports of racist treatment of some Ukraine visitors. We're going to get into that story. Also, what happened when a Republican was actually pressed to answer for Donald Trump praising the adversary that the United States is dealing with right now, Vladimir Putin. Also, before the hour's up, I'll explain to you why I was at the White House today. Stay with us.
Got my head. I like to say they're huge, but they're not that big, and this is dangerous for them.
All right, let's talk about a little bit of the bigger picture here on the troop movements, where the Russians have captured territory, the directions that they're moving in. We do know that in Kyiv, in Mykolaiv, and in Kharkiv, the Ukrainians are putting up resistance, but the Belarusian troops could be coming in, according to our sources. How does that change the landscape of the battle?
Actually, I don't think it changes it that much. Actually, I think it's the beginning of the long end of the Alexander Lukashenko regime, because most of those Belarusian troops, maybe 60, 70, 80,000 active, and then 250,000, if you will, reservists, are conscripts. And the same thing as the Russian conscripts. They're now encountering fierce Ukrainian resistance from Slavic brothers. I think this is, Belarus had those protests in 2021. Right. I think this is the beginning of the end for them.
Okay, let's talk about the convoy that we've observed here, just outside Kyiv. 3-mile-long Russian convoy. They're having problems resupplying their forward units. Talk about that.
All right, just look at this. This is happening all over Ukraine. And you have these soft-skinned vehicles, again, driven mostly by conscripts, not combat troops. They need combat troops to protect them because the wolves are out there, meaning the partisans. You're going to be getting points of resistance. We got to remember that from 41 to 1944, the fiercest resistance to the Nazis in the partisan fight was over this ground in Ukraine and Belarus. And this will be really, really hard to sustain. Yeah.
All right, well, it's going to be really interesting to see if they can resupply these convoys, get their forces ramped up in and around Kyiv as the battle unfolds in the coming hours. Wolf, we're going to be watching this in real time as that battle for the capital city unfolds.
Excellent, excellent analysis. General Zwak, thank you very, very much for joining us. Coming up, the Ukrainian refugee crisis worsening tonight as the Russian military opens fire on residential neighborhoods and civilian casualties grow. The United Nations now says at least 520,000 Ukrainians have fled the country. Our special coverage will continue.
In this market, you'll find Fisher Investment.
20 degrees above average during the day today. Here are those clouds coming in from the northwest. They're not going to do anything.
To date, 2 programs have graduated 18 fellows.
This Medical Minute, sponsored by Avera.
A cardiac event can happen at any time, and these emergencies often require swift response and medical treatment. Many times, cardiac patients have a stent put in place, which is a tiny tube placed into an artery. The small device can make a big impact in saving a life.
A stent procedure, at least in the interventional cardiology world, is one of the more common procedures that we perform. Patients who are having symptoms, particularly those that are refractory to medical therapy, and again, anginal symptoms like chest discomfort, shortness of breath, putting a stent in and opening up a narrowed or blocked artery can have a profound impact on their quality of life and ability to exert themselves and do normal activity.
One of their who had a stent placed in 2015. That happened after doctors discovered she had a narrowing artery. She turned that experience into what's now her life's mission. We have more on her story tonight on Dakota News Now at 10. And we have more about heart health and the Mended Hearts program over at avera.org/medical minute. Phil has one more check of the forecast when we come back.
At a perilous time for his administration politically. Congressional correspondent Chad Pergram is on Capitol Hill with a preview. Good evening, Chad.
Good evening, Brett. One step forward, one step back for this year's State of the Union, but unlike last year, this speech is open to all members. Plus, they dropped the mask mandate for the speech. However, the security fence is back. That's both for the speech and potential truckers arriving later this week. The president delivers the speech on a turbulent world stage amid the Russian invasion.
Make no mistake, this crisis does not and will not end with Ukraine.
Today, President Putin is more isolated than ever before, while democracies have rallied together. And this is much to the credit of President Biden.
The president's national security team is presenting a classified briefing to all House members right now, the Senate later tonight. There's now a push to arm Ukraine and provide billions in humanitarian assistance. The Ukrainian ambassador to Washington met with members on Capitol Hill.
We believe Russia, which is now acting like Nazi Germany during the World War II, essentially killing innocent civilians. Today they shot into, again, into not only residential areas, but also the orphanages and schools and kindergartens. It's horrible. They have to pay the price.
But the biggest international crisis since 9/11 is steering the president away from talking about inflation and gas prices tomorrow night. It also steals the spotlight from his nomination of Ketanji Brown Jackson for the Supreme Court. Democratic whip Jim Clyburn preferred the more moderate Michelle Childs over Jackson.
We all have our personal preferences. We all have our reasonable biases. But in the final analysis, I think this was a good choice.
GOP members believe the president missed an opportunity for unity. Jackson is a liberal, thought by some to be soft on crime. Jackson starts meetings with senators Wednesday. Hearings could come late next month. Brett.
Chad Pergram live on the Hill. Chad, thanks. Up next, we'll go to the touchscreen to look at recent attacks in Ukraine and where military forces are and may be heading. First, here's what some of our Fox affiliates around the country are covering tonight. Fox 13 in Seattle, as a strong storm fueled by the so-called atmospheric river brings rain, snow, and the threat of flooding and avalanches to.
Feel the power of contrast therapy.
Be a crucial part of the battle. Fighting in an urban area, you can't defend the perimeter of a city successfully. You got to go back into the towers and churches and fight from out of buildings with anti-tank weapons. If you do that, it's going to be catastrophic damage to not just the city itself, but the civilian people.
When you refer to the prerequisite threat to justify the potential use of nuclear weapons, do you view this then as Putin effectively changing policy, that he would have previously basically accepted the statement you made and he's now changed policy, or you see something more afoot when you say, quote, off the rails?
I think he personally has suddenly found himself immersed in a disaster. He never thought through this adequately. From the start, most of us said this is a strategic disaster for him to conduct a giant, large-scale conventional invasion of a 40 million person country the size of Texas. And it's gone wrong on him in ways that he would have never anticipated. I mean, these international economic sanctions that brilliant Mr. Singh just outlined on your program are going to cause devastating impact on the Russian economy. I think his generals are now going to say to themselves, what has he got us into? The parallel to Hitler, 1936, 39, 41, is just astonishing. He's gotten away with 4 invasions, and he thinks he won in each one of them. Now he's got the 5th one, and it's not working for him. So I think he's going to double down, and we have an ongoing, unrolling catastrophe for these poor, brave Ukrainian people.
And that's the final question to you, sir. You mentioned how these generals may view it. Unlike most people, you have that experience both in directing our forces here in the United States and understanding a bit more about how your counterparts in running any military might view it. Did you ever have a situation where you had to give a lot of thought to crippling economic countermeasures against the United States. Do you have any reason to believe that at a military level, these generals and the people around Putin, and we got a little preview of that in the odd, baroque, bizarre meeting that he publicized going into this, that any of them over the long haul, I'm not talking 5 days, I'm talking months of this type of economic pain, then start to change how they view their strategy or even potential compliance with every aspect of Putin's wishes if it is this debilitating?
Well, I don't think his generals have any leverage left on the guy. That picture of the Minister of Defense and the Chief of General Staff sitting 30 feet away at a table while Putin isolates at the other end was such a bizarre image for him to allow to be put on TV. So I think they're out there wondering what they're going to do about this. These economic sanctions are going to be a hammer. But more importantly, what he's looking at is look at the brilliant job that Secretary Blinken and the Biden administration have done on bringing NATO together. Germany just announced rearmament. They only have 180,000 people in their armed forces. They used to have 5,000 tanks. Now they got 300. So he's rearming, by his policy choices, the richest, most powerful country in Europe. Never mind Poland, Romania, the Balkans.
1 million refugees. And tonight, the unknown number of civilian deaths, including the heartbreaking story of this 6-year-old girl.
All the blood is on Mr. Putin's hands.
Masks in schools. New York, California, and Oregon, just the latest to drop school mask mandates. We sit down with moms who say they've gotten decision fatigue about how to keep their kids safe. Dangerous climate report. Why one scientist is describing the 3,800 pages as a warning your house is on fire. The threat to America's power grid. 60 Minutes exposes the vulnerability of U.S. infrastructure. And an 11-year-old New Jersey surfer who's raising money one wave at a time.
This is the CBS Evening News with Norah O'Donnell, reporting from the nation's capital.
Good evening as we start a new consequential week together. The whole world is waiting, watching with concern about what happens next in Ukraine. Tonight, President Biden was asked directly, should Americans be worried about nuclear war? The president telling our CBS's Nancy Cordes, no. But Vladimir Putin is increasingly isolated. Look, today, again, sitting alone at one end of a long table, far away from even his own advisors. And today, with more than 500,000 refugees leaving their homes in Ukraine, we are reminded about the cost of war and then the impact on families and especially children. The tears that fell down this young boy's cheeks after leaving his father who is fighting in Kyiv. Or these beautiful newborn twin boys sleeping tonight in a bomb shelter. And these children trying to survive not just cancer, but also Putin's war of choice. Well, tonight, Vladimir Putin is under investigation for possible war crimes. Russian forces are still battling to take over Ukraine's biggest cities, but they are meeting stiff resistance. The two sides sat down for their first face-to-face talks in Belarus. The only thing agreed on was to meet again. We have team coverage, and CBS's Charlie D'Agata will start us off tonight from Kyiv. Good evening, Charlie.
Good evening, Nora. That's right. Tonight, Russia is accused of war crimes. Ukraine's UN ambassador is accusing Russia of using thermobaric bombs, one of the most devastating weapons short of nuclear weapons. It's a violation of international law and escalates this conflict to an unthinkable level. Ukraine's demand for an immediate ceasefire went ignored this evening, with Russian artillery opening up around Kyiv. And tonight, worrying developments that Russian troops are tightening the noose. Satellite images reveal a 17-mile-long Russian military convoy headed to Kyiv, now less than 20 miles outside the capital. Ukrainian forces are hitting back everywhere they can. The Defense Ministry releasing drone footage striking another convoy in southern Ukraine. The Interior Ministry says multiple Russian missile strikes in a residential neighborhood in the second-largest city of Kharkiv killed dozens of civilians. As the attacks escalate, so too does the civilian death toll. Emergency teams race to save the life of a 6-year-old girl injured by Russian shelling while shopping for groceries with her parents. Her frantic mother can only watch on. Despite their best efforts, they were unable to save her. Bracing for an onslaught, residents in the capital took advantage when officials lifted the curfew in place since Saturday to stock up on food and supplies.
Considering this is a city under siege, the mood remains remarkably calm here. People are buying, but they're not panic buying. They're stocking up, but they're not stockpiling.
No one knows how long the food or fighting will last.
It's deathly scary. On the other hand, we are very hopeful because we have support from all over the world, emotionally, financially, in military forces.
Support from volunteers, too. A mass production line of Molotov cocktails today loaded onto a truck to hand out to forces around the city. Tonight, mothers and children will huddle together in the shelter at the city's Children's Hospital, trying to provide some comfort to the most vulnerable.
President Zelenskyy has made a late-night address, and he is pointing the finger directly at President Putin, blaming him for what he called a brutal attack on Kharkiv today. He's asking the world to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Nora?
Charlie DAKOTA for us, thank you. Well, the United Nations estimates that more than 500,000 people have already fled Ukraine. Women and children fill the long lines of cars and buses at border checkpoints with Poland, hoping to escape danger. CBS's Chris Livesay is in the western Ukrainian city of Lviv.
For more than 20 miles, Ukrainians wait in the freezing cold for days, longing to reach safety across the border in Poland. It's an exodus that recalls Europe's darkest times, and it's only the beginning. At Lviv's main train station in western Ukraine, thousands are trying desperately to get out.
So you left your father in Ukraine to fight?
Yes, I love my country. This Russia, it's a bad country.
But not everyone can run. Men of fighting age must stay, like 18-year-old medical student Yaroslav, possibly facing the front line.
If I must go, I will go.
Did you ever imagine you'd be faced with something like this?
No, it's like a nightmare.
A nightmare shattering millions of lives. Even those who escape the invasion don't escape unscathed. And these scenes aren't limited to the border with Poland. Virtually every one of Ukraine's European neighbors is taking in refugees. And we're now learning the EU fears more than 7 million people could eventually be displaced. Nora?
Just stunning, Chris Livesay. Thank you. Well, tonight there are increasing signs that Vladimir Putin's invasion could be backfiring, not just because of punishing sanctions from the U.S. and our allies, but 2 Russian oligarchs are reportedly calling on Putin to end the war. And today, the Russian ruble fell to a record low and is now worth less than a penny. CBS's Nancy Cordes has more on the fallout.
Call it financial shock and awe. Standard & Poor's cut Russia's credit rating to junk status today after the Treasury Department froze U.S. assets held by Russia's central bank, driving the value of the ruble down by 30%. As Russians made a run on ATMs, President Putin called an emergency meeting with economic advisors, where he slammed the West as an empire of lies. But the Kremlin's chief spokesman admitted the economic reality has considerably changed. Across the world, stores and bars are removing Russian vodka from the shelves. FedEx and UPS suspended shipments to Russia. And most of Europe has now closed its airspace to Russian planes, turning Moscow's airport into a ghost town. This Aeroflot flight from Moscow to New York was forced to turn back last night, unable to traverse Iceland's airspace. Even the Swiss, famed for their neutrality, said today they would freeze Russian assets. The sports world is responding too, banning the Russian team from soccer's World Cup, even stripping black belt Vladimir Putin of his status as honorary president of the International Judo Foundation.
Putin has been confounded by our collective response. That is why he is resorting to more and more extreme rhetoric.
Today, President Biden dismissed Putin's nuclear threats.
Mr. President, should Americans be worried about nuclear war?
No.
Perhaps, but late today, the administration announced it was expelling 12 Russian diplomats, accusing them of engaging in, quote, espionage activities. The suspected spies have until next week, Nora, to leave the country.
Nancy Cordes at the White House. You can hear the protest. Thank you. Well, tonight we want to show you pictures of the Capitol ahead of tomorrow's State of the Union address. Non-scalable fences are back up, and it comes as
crammed trains and cars and buses log-jammed for dozens of miles, tens of thousands on foot, dragging bags, clutching their children. The hub of the biggest, fastest displacement of people since World War II was Lviv. We were at the station this morning as that train to Poland clanked in. Thousands packed into the tunnels, standing on the stairs, documents in hand, bags at the ready for their chance. Authorities handing out food, which was passed back hand to hand down the stairs. With men of fighting age banned from leaving, it was the very young and very old. The majority, women and children. Yesterday, there weren't enough trains.
This is absolute chaos.
There is no scheduled train. The possible, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow morning, maybe in 2 days.
Today, the trains did arrive, but very few men from any country allowed on.
We've been watching this group of South Asians and Africans try to get on this train. They keep getting pushed back. They're told only women and children, told to wait their turn, but they've been here for days. Their turn hasn't come.
The routes out of this country littered with sorrow and fear. This boy on the road to the border. He takes a breath because what he's about to say was so hard.
Папа будет продавать что-то, будет помогать нашим героям, нашим войскам, будет помогать, может даже будет воевать.
Back on that train platform, the doors close, that little girl still crying. Her mother crying too. I was told they're leaving the girl's father behind. That hand on the window, those tears, the language of exile.
That one image alone, Matt, driving this whole story home. Matt Gutman with us tonight from Lviv. And Matt, the moment with the young mother, her daughter, clutching the stuffed animal, countless stories like this playing out. And I know the UN is trying to ramp up their efforts to help the refugees. And as you can imagine, Matt, back here at home, so many viewers have been reaching out to us asking, is there any way they can help?
David, I just got off the phone with the UN. They say the first priority, warm clothes, blankets, sleeping bags. The second priority is accommodations, getting these people a place to stay over the next few nights. The third priority, getting them back home soon. Now, we put together an article with a list of resources for anybody out there who wants to help. It's up right now on abcnews.com. David.
All right, Matt Gutman reporting from Lviv. Matt, thank you. Tonight, the pressure on Russia and on Vladimir Putin is growing. New sanctions on its central bank just today. Russians now lining up at banks only to find ATMs out of cash. International flights now grounded. Some Russians telling Western journalists they don't support this war from Putin, some in tears, others protesting in the streets. But as our team has witnessed there, so many arrested, swiftly taken off the streets. And after this move to put nuclear forces on heightened alert by Putin, who's advising him and how isolated has Vladimir Putin become? James Longman from Moscow tonight.
Tonight, Russia is feeling the shock of Western sanctions, growing increasingly isolated from the world, a nation beginning to suffer for one man's war. The wave of economic measures unrelenting, Switzerland announcing it will break from its tradition of neutrality to freeze Russian assets, and the US now targeting Russia's central bank. Long lines at some banks and ATMs, many anxious to withdraw cash as the ruble sinks further against the dollar. And a growing fear of skyrocketing prices. Russia's central bank even closing the stock market early to avoid a crash. But still today, Putin defiant, calling the West an empire of lies.
Ordinary Russians are already starting to see their lives change because of sanctions, but Vladimir Putin could probably convince them that it's the West's fault. But what about those closest to him, the elite, the ones who've benefited from the luxurious perks of modern Russian life? Do they really want to follow Vladimir Putin down this apparent path towards economic misery?
All of this coming as Europe closes its airspace to Russian aircraft. With far fewer flights, the US is now telling its citizens to leave Russia immediately. And tonight, in response, Russia is banning airlines from 36 countries. The international outrage is growing. Soccer's governing bodies banning Russia from the World Cup and all competitions. Shell Oil announcing it will quit all its Russian operations. That follows BP, who divested its nearly 20% stake in the country's key oil company Rosneft. FedEx and UPS are also halting all shipments into the country. Google and Facebook's parent company Meta also blocking Russian state media from receiving money for ads. The potential for unrest in Russia, high, with riot police flooding the streets and more than 5,000 people arrested in anti-war protests so far. The thought of closing Russia off and rolling back 30 years of progress since the Cold War, unthinkable to many Russians.
Экономика, оно такое, оно восстановится, а людей постфакту уже не вернуть. Как бы, а полетать...
Just an extraordinary scene unfolding inside Russia. And James, I just wanted to inform our viewers that a senior defense official here in the U.S. Saying on this heightened nuclear alert status today that I don't believe we've seen anything specific as a result of this direction from Putin, at least not yet in terms of noticeable muscle movement. But there are so many who are asking who remains in Putin's inner circle. Who is he listening to at this point, if anyone?
Well, David, all the evidence suggests that this is a man increasingly alone, but those around Putin have the same Cold War mentality as him. They cannot afford perceived failure in Ukraine. The danger is he's not receiving accurate information about how this invasion is going or what the costs really are. David?
James Longman in Moscow for us again tonight. Thank you, James. And this crisis in Ukraine coming as President Biden prepares to deliver his first State of the Union address tomorrow night to the nation. I want to get right to senior White House correspondent Mary Bruce live at the White House tonight. And Mary, the president and his team forced to rework parts of this speech in light of this Russian invasion. I'm curious what your sources are telling you tonight about how the president plans to reshape his message to the American people.
Well, no question, David, this is going to be a very different speech than the one the president was probably envisioning just a few weeks ago. We are told he's going to highlight the steps he's taken to fight back against Vladimir Putin and this invasion and to support the Ukrainian people. He's also likely to tout the role the U.S. has played in really uniting the West and rallying the world to protect democratic values against this Russian aggression. But Biden is also facing very real challenges here at home, everything from inflation to rising gas prices and trying to turn the page on this pandemic. Now, tonight, I'm told the president is still tweaking this address. He's working with his speechwriters and policy advisors. He has been doing some run-throughs, though, and he's putting on the finishing touches. David.
We'll see you there tomorrow, Mary. Thank you. We will be in Washington tomorrow for the president's address. We'll be broadcasting World News Tonight from D.C. and then full coverage of the State of the Union. That begins at 9 p.m. Eastern. We hope you'll join us right here tomorrow night. In the meantime, there's also news on the pandemic tonight. More states moving to drop mask mandates, including New York and California. And tonight here, this new study on how effective the Pfizer vaccine is for children 5 to 11. Here's Stephanie Ramos.
Tonight, across the country, more schools are dropping masks. California, Oregon, and Washington State jointly announcing they'll move from requiring to recommending masks in schools after March 11th. In Connecticut and Massachusetts, it was a big step for students like second grader Neil Hughes.
When was the last time you were in school with no mask on?
Kindergarten.
And New York's governor lifting the mask mandate in schools on Wednesday.
My friends, the day has come.
But more than 1 million students in New York City will need to wait until Friday to learn whether the mayor will end its school mask mandate next week. And tonight, new data from the height of the Omicron surge in New York suggests the Pfizer pediatric dose vaccine was less effective in 5 to 11-year-olds than the full dose vaccine in teens and adults, providing minimal protection against infection a month after vaccination. But researchers stress the Pfizer vaccine still protected against severe disease, the most critical measure.
I think it's likely that that this could either be fixed by changing dose or giving a boost.
David, we've seen how effective the third shot is in adults. Right now, boosters are already recommended for kids 12 and older, and Pfizer now says they are testing that third dose in children under 11. David.
Stephanie Ramos with us on a Monday night. Thank you, Stephanie. Climate change scientists thought that the window is, quote, rapidly closing to avoid its deadly consequences. In fact, they say nearly half the world's population living in the so-called danger zone now. The report finding that even if warming is limited to 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, which has been a global goal, still up to 14% of species will face a very high risk of extinction. And in some regions of the world, food and water will become increasingly scarce. When we come back here on a Monday night, the frightening school bus accident, nearly a dozen children and the bus driver injured, and then the boy in the piano. This is an unforgettable image.
And this has all come to a head now. So, you know, it bears watching, and I'm sure my former colleagues in the intelligence community are watching us very intensely.
As they should. Putin, as you know, has also put Russian nuclear deterrent forces on what's called high alert. How great is the risk of a serious, very serious miscalculation right now that could have truly devastating consequences potentially?
Well, it's, you know, we're in a higher state of risk than we were a week ago. That's very clear. I do think the administration did exactly the right thing and not react by a concomitant raise in our alert level. And there is the issue of what exactly was meant by what he said. The first thing I would be interested in is are there any physical manifestations of a higher state of readiness for the Soviet strategic nuclear forces? Specifically, for example, have road mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles deployed out of garrison at a higher rate than possible? Or are there additional sea-launched ballistic missile carrying subs that have deployed? So you'd be looking for those sort of physical manifestations of a heightened alert. This could maybe meant nothing more than a heightened state of command and control. Ensure that your communications are up to snuff so that you could actually transmit orders. It may have been nothing more than that. But the fact that he said it is, for me at least, raises a concern.
Do you see an off-ramp at all for Putin?
You know, I've been brainstorming a lot about that, and it's hard for me to come up with a face-saving off-ramp at this point for Putin. I just don't know what that would be. I wish there were one.
Me too. The former Director of National Intelligence, retired General James Clapper, thanks so much for joining us. We'll continue this conversation. Just ahead, there's more on the breaking news. I'll speak live with a key member of Ukraine's parliament hunkered down in the capital tonight as Russian forces are closing in. Stay with us. You're in the Situation Room.
Every can cause serious and in rare cases.
Of tonight's outcome, both teams are set to play.
Can you save water running a less than
used through FERC to be able to cut off natural gas exports and natural gas pipeline expansion. He is literally limiting access to oil and gas to the world.
It's time for the president and some of our European partners to quit pussyfooting around. I know that they say they've sanctioned 80% of the banks in Russia. Well, Vladimir Putin controls 100% of the banks in Russia. He can use the other 20% to continue to finance his war machine.
Just some of the sounds from leaders around what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. Let's bring in our panel. Juan Williams, Fox News analyst, Jason Riley, Wall Street Journal columnist and senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and syndicated radio host Hugh Hewitt. Hugh, I talked with Britt about the amazing outpouring from European nations, some that have not been active on this front before, and a change in tide there. But what the Biden administration is doing and not doing is a factor ahead of the State of the Union address tomorrow.
Well, I heard Brett say what I also believe, Brett, and I heard that exchange. We have to sanction Russian oil. Russian oil is paying for cluster bombs that are killing children in Kyiv and Kharkiv and other cities throughout Ukraine. There is a direct line from Russian oil, the money that comes in, the invasion that's underway, the atrocities for which hopefully war crime trials will be held. 57% of people asked by Quinnipiac in a new poll release today. Has President Biden been too tough, not tough enough, or just right? 57% said not tough enough. I think they are talking about the oil sanctions. We need to stop that oil. We need to do it yesterday. Hopefully he'll announce it in the State of the Union.
You know, correspondents over there, our own Trey Yingst, Steve Harrigan, Lucas Thomas, and Benjamin Hall, but other networks obviously have their own. One of them is NBC's chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, who tweeted this: perhaps the biggest risk calculation moral dilemma of the war so far, this massive Russian convoy about 30 miles from Kyiv. The U.S. NATO could likely destroy it, but that would be direct involvement against Russia and risk everything. Does the West watch in silence as it rolls? It's a great question, Juan, and one in which we're going to have to deal with the images that come from whatever happens on the ground, probably in coming days.
I think that's right, but a hot war between the United States and Russia, two nuclear powers, Brett, I don't think that is exactly what the world wants. I don't think it's what the American people want at this juncture. I think what we want is understanding, and I just go back to what we heard in the previous segment, that we're dealing with someone who appears to be erratic. The normal purpose, planning, perspective that we associate with a calculating former KGB agent, Vladimir Putin, is absent. And I think he's trying to provoke some reaction from the United States, from even the NATO allies, that would therefore allow him to justify taking more brutal action against the Ukraine. And I think in coming days, given the fact that his military is not having success, he's going to try to ramp things up. And we've got to be in position to be patient, to use the high-level intelligence we've had to preview and anticipate his moves, rather than play into his hand and suddenly make us the topic of conversation rather than his villainy.
Fair enough. And there are a lot of questions about the erratic behavior of Vladimir Putin. The Ukrainian ambassador to the United Nations presented these texts from a Russian soldier to his mother, a dead Russian soldier now. Take a listen.
Mama, I'm in Ukraine.
Тут настоящая
There
война.
is a real war raging
Мне
here.
страшно.
I'm afraid.
Мы бьем по всем городам.
We are bombing
Подряд.
all of the
Даже по
cities
мирным
together, even targeting civilians.
Нам сказали, что они
We
нас
were
будут
told
приветствовать.
that they would welcome us.
А они кидаются под нашу
And
технику.
they are falling under
И не
our
дают
armored
проехать.
vehicles, throwing themselves under the wheels and not allowing us to
Называют нас
pass.
фашистами.
They call us fascists.
Мама, мне очень тяжело.
Mama, this is so
In
hard.
several moments he was killed.
And this was several moments before he was killed.
Now, Jason, obviously we have no way to authenticate that text, but the United Nations, the ambassador is reading it to the United Nations. Both sides trying to make their case, but that is compelling, and you wonder how much Russian forces have a morale issue as they go through Ukraine.
Sure, Brett, but this is also part of the targeted sanction strategy that others have been critiquing. It's only going to prolong that type of suffering. If we're going to do sanctions, they need to be comprehensive and they need to be severe. And to spare the energy sector, which is the lifeline of Putin and Russia, doesn't make a lot of sense here. You've got to go after the energy sector. Biden is concerned. One of the reasons we're not doing this is out of domestic policy concerns of Joe Biden. He's worried that it will redound to energy prices here in the U.S., where inflation is already at a 40-year high. He doesn't want to exacerbate that situation. But if Biden wants to tackle that, then stop the war on fossil fuels here in the U.S. Open up the drilling on federal lands. We are, a large energy producer. Exploit that. Tell Europe, if you don't get it from Russia, you'll get it from us. That is the way to handle that. But we have to go after the energy sector ultimately if we want to make Putin and Russia feel the pain.
But Hugh, the possibility that President Biden is going to say something like that about energy here in the U.S. at the State of the Union is probably what percentage?
5%. But if he does not, I hope tomorrow night, Brett, that Nancy Pelosi in her last State of the Union behind the president rips up the speech like she did, because unless the president does that, children are going to continue to die from cluster bombs in the big cities of Ukraine.
And that 75% of Russia's troops along Ukraine's border are now in the country. One of their main targets today, the eastern city of Kharkiv. Russia attacked the city with what looked like indiscriminate fire. To the south, the small port city of Berdyansk was also attacked. The mayor says Russian troops took over the city. But even then, people didn't give up. Protesters confronting the Russian troops and heckling them, shouting, "Berdyansk is Ukraine." But Russian forces seem to have a bigger plan in mind. This convoy of Russian equipment and troops reportedly stretches for 17 miles outside of Kiev. But Russia's advance has been plagued by logistics failures. Some Russian vehicles literally running out of gas. A Ukrainian man pulling alongside this armored vehicle. Broken down, he asks? The diesel is out, the soldier says. I can only tow you back to Russia, the Ukrainian says. And the soldier laughs. In Kiev, residents are preparing for street-to-street.
Up, sports viewers, and enjoy Arby's corned beef Reuben. Arby's corned beef. Arby's. Come on! Arby's, we have the meats.
Tonight, the fierce fight being waged by Ukrainian forces against the Russian invasion. Massive new explosions in Ukraine's largest cities. Russia accused of using cluster bombs on civilians. The rising toll, at least 7 children among the dead. Ukraine's forces standing their ground. Drone video appearing to show them taking out a Russian convoy. But outside the capital, another Russian convoy stretching some 17 miles. The two sides meeting for high-stakes talks after Vladimir Putin put his nuclear forces on high alert. And now the investigation being launched. Has Russia committed war crimes? Also, the mass exodus, more than 500,000 Ukrainians fleeing the country, families torn apart, the mounting humanitarian crisis, and the growing impact of sanctions. The U.S. today freezing Russia's central bank as the ruble crashes. Panicked Russians lining up at ATMs for cash. And tonight, the new data on Pfizer's COVID vaccine. How effective is it for kids 5 to 11? It comes as several more states announce they're lifting their mask mandates in schools. What parents need to know. And the stark warning on climate change. What a new UN report says must be done right now to avoid the worst impacts.
This is NBC Nightly News with Lester Holt.
Good evening, everyone. Ukraine's army of soldiers and citizen soldiers have stunned the world with their tenacity and resolve. But Russian troops are not rolling over, but in fact rolling forward. Peace talks going nowhere today as Ukraine's second largest city, Kharkiv, came under intense shelling attack. Satellite images capture a miles-long Russian convoy of armored vehicles that could soon be headed to the capital of Kyiv. Russia now bringing to bear 3/4 of its invasion force as it tries to regain momentum and choke off Ukrainian cities. But Russia feeling a squeeze of its own. More nations of the world, including normally neutral Switzerland, stepping up to isolate the Russian economy. Tonight, as the number of refugees flowing out of Ukrainian cities reaches 500,000, the International Criminal Court says it's opening an investigation into possible war crimes. Our correspondents are in place overseas and here in Washington. Richard Engel starts us off from the front lines.
Many U.S. intelligence officials predicted the Ukrainian military would have collapsed by now. But as Russia's assault is intensifying, so is Ukrainian resistance. Ukraine's military claims this drone video shows it taking out a convoy of Russian forces, while Ukraine's President Zelenskyy defied President Putin's demand that his country sever ties with the West, signing an application today to join the European Union, a process that could take years. The UN now says at least 7 children have been killed in the Russian onslaught. Officials in Kiev say among them is a 4th grader named Polina. Peace talks along the border have concluded for now. Russia saying progress is being made. Ukraine agreeing to more talks, but with low expectations. As Putin denounced the West as an empire of lies after earlier raising alarms, saying he was ordering Russia's nuclear defenses on higher alert. Although tonight, a senior American defense official says the U.S. has seen no movement of Russia's nuclear forces, and that 75% of Russia's troops along Ukraine's border are now in the country. One of their main targets today, the eastern city of Kharkiv. Russia attacked the city with what looked like indiscriminate fire. To the south, the small port city of Berdyansk was also attacked. The mayor says Russian troops took over the city. But even then, people didn't give up. Protesters confronting the Russian troops and heckling them, shouting, "Berdyansk is Ukraine." But Russian forces seem to have a bigger plan in mind. This convoy of Russian equipment and troops reportedly stretches for 17 miles outside of Kiev. But Russia's advance has been plagued by logistics failures. Some Russian vehicles literally running out of gas. A Ukrainian man pulling alongside this armored vehicle. Broken down, he asks? The diesel is out, the soldier says. I can only tow you back to Russia, the Ukrainian says. And the soldier laughs. In Kiev, residents are preparing for street-to-street fighting, mixing Molotov cocktails as fast as they can fill bottles.
That's why we are fighting for our freedom, for our self-reliance, for ourselves, for our houses, for our children. We'll stand till the end.
We followed volunteers who brought the firebombs in wheelbarrows to nearby checkpoints, manned by Ukrainian veterans and anyone else with a gun and who's trusted in the neighborhood.
I'm living here. This is my home. All people in this district, we are saved.
Many Ukrainians are staying, determined to die fighting rather than lose their nation.
Richard, there's understandably a lot of concern tonight about that Russian convoy heading into the capital where you are. Do we know, does this represent a change in tactics by the Russians?
It seems to be. This convoy is big, dangerous, and heading this way. Up until now, Russia has tried to use small unit tactics and precision strikes, and it hasn't been going so well. And after what we saw in Kharkiv today and with this convoy, it seems that now they're going to a more traditional Russian strategy of siege and destruction.
All right. We wish you and your team continued safe passings. All right, thank you, Richard. In another major Ukrainian city, Kharkiv in the northeast, not far from Russia, devastating new attacks and fighting today and more casualties. Matt Bradley spent weeks there. He's got the latest for us tonight.
Tonight, a worsening humanitarian catastrophe in Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. Today, the scene of street-to-street combat that left at least 9 people dead, including 3 children and dozens injured.
This is a residential area with no military objects.
And added to mounting evidence that Vladimir Putin's war has put civilians in the crosshairs. A school destroyed not far from the center of the city, missile fragments inside a residential apartment building. Today, the International Criminal Court launching a probe for war crimes against humanity. Maria Avdiva, a Kharkiv resident, shot this video inside Kharkiv at a children's clothing factory.
Do you feel as though the Russians were deliberately targeting civilian targets?
For sure, they did it deliberately.
She said Russia did much of this bombing while negotiating peace talks.
This will happen with all enemies who will come here. We are actually on the verge of a large humanitarian crisis.
Of most concern is the sight of cluster munitions, bombs that open in midair and spray smaller bombs.
It's clearly a cluster munition attack. We think that cluster munitions should never be used at all.
They're banned by 110 countries, though not by Russia or the U.S. Still, the U.S. hasn't used them since the first Gulf War over 30 years ago. Their use by the Russians in Ukraine, another sign of this war's growing savagery. Matt Bradley, NBC News, Uman, Ukraine.
And people from Kharkiv are among the 500,000 refugees the UN says have poured out of Ukraine since the invasion began. Many are making their way to western Ukraine to try to cross the border. Tom Yamas is there and spoke with some of them.
Tonight, fires burning outside of the Lviv train station in western Ukraine. Inside the station, the massive exodus comes to light.
This is what it looks and feels like to try to escape Ukraine right now. These are families trying to board those trains to Poland. These entranceways are filled with people. It is sad, it is desperate, but this is one of the only ways these families can get out. Who are you traveling with here?
I was my daughter.
Yevgenia and her daughter Emma are trying to reach Poland. But what truly breaks this mother's heart is that her husband is there to say goodbye. He says he's going back to help defend his country. Men of fighting age are not allowed to leave.
So hard and so scary about my husband. I don't want to say goodbye.
Russia's victims in this war stretch farther than the battlefield.
It's a wonderful city.
And it was being destroyed.
Yes. It's destroyed. Russia destroyed all.
Svetlana and her son David have traveled from the east to the west, trying to find a way out. Tomorrow, they leave for Romania. David has an ID card in case they are separated. He's only 9 years old, but already understands some of the realities of this war.
Putin monster. Putin is a monster. Yes. He killed us. He just killed.
As hundreds of thousands flee for safety, so many others staying put and preparing.
It makes temperature of fire more high.
In an old and unmarked warehouse that smelled like a gas station, we met Igor.
You're going to use this to take on the Russians?
Yes.
He's crafting these Molotov cocktails around the clock.
How many of these cocktails have you made?
2,500.
2,000?
Yes.
2,500.
Yes.
And he says he's not alone.
If you could talk to the Russian troops, the Russian military, what would you tell them?
Go away. Go out from Ukraine, off from us. They have their own country. Why they're going to us?
And Tom, it's interesting to note this is not just one-way traffic we're looking at. There are people trying to get into Ukraine, correct?
That's right, Lester. Ukraine's president has called on any foreigners who want to help them fight Russia to contact the Ukrainian missions in their respective countries and sign up. And just today, we encountered a group who had traveled in from the UK. They told us they're Ukrainians who have come back to fight the Russians. Lester?
Tom Yamas tonight, thank you. And the U.S. and its allies are ramping up sanctions against Russia and sending Ukraine new military aid. All of it comes as President Biden prepares for tomorrow's State of the Union address. Kristen Welker is at the White House.
Tonight, as Russia wages war against Ukraine, the United States and its allies are unleashing an increasingly tough response, imposing unprecedented sanctions aimed at choking the Russian economy and stopping Vladimir Putin, who put some of his nuclear forces on higher alert, the Russian ambassador to the UN today.
So that is a kind of deterrence that we're exercising.
The U.S. says it's not changing its nuclear alert level. President Biden pressed by a reporter on the nuclear threat.
President, should Americans be worried about nuclear war?
No.
Today, the U.S. targeting the country's central bank with sanctions, cutting it off from accessing U.S. assets and dollars. Even neutral Switzerland announced it will join in, imposing new penalties on Putin. It comes on the heels of the U.S. and its allies expelling some, though not all, of Russia's banks from the SWIFT financial system, effectively barring them from international financial transactions. Still, some want the White House to go even further.
I believe we should have used more of these tools prior to this brutal escalation to deter Putin and to weaken his capacity to wage war.
The Biden administration also announcing another $350 million in military aid to Ukraine, including anti-aircraft systems and ammunition. Countries like Sweden are sending in anti-tank missiles, the EU sending fighter jets, and the administration is sending $54 million in humanitarian aid. All of it comes on the eve of the president's first State of the Union address. In a new poll, only 33% of Americans approve of the president's handling of the Ukraine-Russia crisis. 47% disapprove, and a majority of Americans say the president cannot be trusted in a crisis. Ukraine, now another crisis in focus tomorrow night.
Is he rewriting it to have it focus on this moment?
Every State of the Union address is an opportunity for the president delivering it to speak directly to the American people about what is happening in that moment, the progress that's being made, and also the challenges we're facing.
Kristen, we just learned the Biden administration is expelling 12 Russian diplomats. Do we know why?
Well, Lester, Press Secretary Jen Psaki said those diplomats were engaging in espionage, which is a clear violation of their status here. Lester.
Kristen Welker, thank you. Make sure to join us for special coverage of the President's State of the Union address tomorrow night at 9 Eastern Time, 6 Pacific. This evening, some Russians are reacting with increasing concern about the war and the global sanctions rippling through the economy. But despite those sanctions, Russia maintains an export economic lifeline. Keir Simmons is in Moscow now with that part of the story.
Tonight, protests are growing, and so are signs of panic amongst some middle-class Russians. Crowds lining up at banks, many hoping to withdraw dollars or euros. Tonight, the Russian ruble has fallen to a record low. The Russian stock market suspended all week, with fears it could crash. In a mall, we find more lines at ATMs.
Everyone's scared now.
And meet musicians Marina, who lived in Boston for 6 years, and Natalie.
My husband was trying to buy foreign currency yesterday. He didn't get a chance to do that.
Couldn't get any?
No.
Now they fear they may be banned from Europe, a new iron curtain between Russia and the West.
We don't want war.
But there are few signs President Putin is listening, meeting morose-looking central bankers today at a distance. Though Putin does have support, including a thumbs up from this man. Putin is a world leader, he says. Others openly questioning the Russian leader's reasoning.
No war from Ukraine.
And what do you feel about President Putin's nuclear threats over the weekend?
I think he can, because I think he's crazy now.
But President Biden and the West left a carve-out in these sanctions that likely still benefits President Putin. Oil and gas is still allowed to flow out of Russia, a trade worth hundreds of millions of dollars a day. Lester?
Keir Simmons in Moscow tonight. Thank you. In just 60 seconds, the propaganda war over Ukraine. Are social media giants doing enough to combat disinformation? And as masks come off in schools, we look at the COVID vaccine and younger kids with new questions being raised tonight about the effectiveness.
At WashingtonPavilion.org or 605-367-6000.
It was Abraham Lincoln who once said, "Everybody likes a compliment."
And during Carl's President's Day sale, you can compliment your home with new appliances.
Get them back to their country of origin, or, in the case of some of the Afghans who have been living in Ukraine since Kabul fell and since Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, we need to find a place in Europe to make sure that they have a safe place to live so that they're not forced into exile yet again.
And finally, in the small time I have left, you have, of course, written about European security and Europe's response to humanitarian crises in the past. Do you believe, looking at Europe's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that European security and how it responds to Russian aggression is, frankly, forever changed?
Well, in some ways, when you think about the war itself that Putin has waged, you could say in the worst sense, it has been for so many in Europe and in Ukraine, the unthinkable becoming not only thinkable, but done. But on the other side, if a week ago you had said that the European Union for the first time in its history would be providing security assistance at this scale, or any security assistance, people would have said, no, that's unthinkable, and here we see that happen. So I think the recognition that there are threats out there and that it is extremely important to invest in European security, in national security, and in collective security has really hit home, and we're seeing these incredibly important concrete steps commensurate with that.
Ambassador Samantha Power, thank you very much.
Taken down over the weekend. Twitter tells NBC News it permanently banned similar accounts. Facebook also revealed a separate hacking campaign linked to Belarus, targeting real Ukrainian military members, public officials, and journalists.
Are Facebook and Instagram users safe as this invasion continues on your platforms?
I think everyone needs to take steps to make sure that they're safe online. We're taking every step that we can to make sure that our users and our platforms are safe.
Meta says it doesn't know how long the users behind these accounts have been active, but believes the group is linked to other trolls who spread misinformation about the 2020 U.S. presidential election and the COVID vaccine. Despite tech giants taking action, bad actors often work across platforms, like this account called Ukraine Today, removed by Facebook but still active on Google News. Google did not respond to our requests for comment.
The challenge is they oftentimes don't know what they're looking for. The only way to really figure that out is with public-private partnerships, social media companies working with governments to try and figure out who's really behind the accounts.
And Joe, speaking of concerns about what's happening online, Ukraine received a major delivery from Elon Musk today. What was it?
Yeah, that's right, Lester. 48 hours after Ukraine's digital minister asked Elon Musk to help with internet access that's been disrupted by this invasion, Musk appears to have delivered. The minister tweeting this photo saying thanks for these Starlink terminals. They're small devices that connect users to satellite internet services from SpaceX. And Musk replying, "You are most welcome." Lester?
All right, Jolene Kent with that. Thank you. And the backlash to Russia's invasion has now grown to the world of sports. Russia will miss out on the World Cup now that it's been suspended indefinitely from international soccer. It comes after Olympic officials called for Russia to be excluded from international events. The NHL also announcing it is suspending ties to Russia, and Russia has been barred from hosting sanctioned boxing matches. There's news tonight about the COVID vaccine and children. A new study casting doubt on the effectiveness of the Pfizer vaccine.
Employed mass fires, including against civilian targets in the cities. They have not shut down the internet. They have not shut down the communications links. They have not turned the lights off in Kyiv. And I expected this to be much more brutal in the days ahead.
Well, they are managing to kill some civilians, but I hear you saying this is the very early stages of that. Andrew Weiss, in connection with all of this, with the Western support, we're hearing more countries say they are prepared and are now planning to ship weapons to the Ukrainians. How fast will those weapons get to Ukraine? Can they get there fast enough to make a difference?
So it's a really good question. Yesterday and over the weekend, we saw European leaders make dramatic and unprecedented decisions. The German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, announced for the first time Germany will send weapons into an active conflict. This is a major, almost seismic change in German foreign policy. And then equally impressive, the European Union is going to use its capacities, which are financial, toward military aid for Ukraine. The question on the Ukrainian side is there's probably limits on the absorptive capacity of the Ukrainian military based on the fact that they're in the fight, and getting equipment and other material to them trained up and deployed is something that doesn't happen overnight. Longer term, the question is, as the military advance continues, the General Lute was describing, is how does the Ukrainian force fall back if it needs to? And what do we do in the West to support them in a desperate situation if the Russians continue to escalate? I think that's the real challenge ahead. Vladimir Putin is very likely to escalate things. He's not likely to walk out of Ukraine with his tail between his legs.
And it's a reminder as we watch this, we're all watching this hour by hour, expecting to know where things stand. But as both of you are pointing out, this is going to be drawn out. Let me bring you into the conversation now, Adam Smith. We have seen, I guess you could say, unprecedented economic sanctions raining down on the Russians. What are you seeing that, and how do you see it making a difference in Moscow?
So it's not just unprecedented in name, it is unprecedented in type, in style. This has never been done. The entire G7 deciding to sanction the central bank of a major economy, never been done at all. Whether or not the impact will lead to the outcome that we all want, I think time will tell. There are going to be two levels of this impact. The first we're already seeing, and that's sort of the shock and the panic. That's the ruble falling by 40%. That's the Moscow Stock Exchange seizing up. That's people trying to dollarize assets quickly. That is going to continue, but that will subside to a degree. And then over time, in the space of weeks and certainly months, the broader economic sanctions, both with respect to the central bank, which are very, very impactful, the sanctions with respect to export controls and otherwise, will start to hit. And then I think that over time, again, in the space of weeks and certainly months, the impact on the economic fortunes of the average Russian, let alone Mr. Putin, I think will start to wane significantly. But again, this is unprecedented for the world community in this context.
But do I hear you saying, Adam Smith, though, that people in Russia are not going to feel this in the immediate, in the days ahead?
No, the panic they're feeling right now. The panic, that's where the reduction in the price of the value of the ruble, the increased interest rates that will lead to inflation, that will all happen. But that's very much a panic response. The more impactful issue, the more impact where sanctions actually will turn to bite, that's going to be in the weeks and months to come, when the central bank runs out of money that it can use, when the ability for Russians to import things will cease or seize up significantly. So there's this panic approach right now, which will certainly be impactful, but the real impact of squeezing Mr. Putin, I think that's going to take a few weeks, unfortunately, if not longer.
Adam Weiss, how do you see Vladimir Putin feeling all this? Do you agree it could take weeks, if not longer, for him to feel any real pain from this?
Well, there's one important issue that President Biden has highlighted up front. The Western governments are carving out exceptions for purchases of Russian oil and gas amid all of these unprecedented financial sanctions. And so if you look at just very rough numbers, in 2021, Russia exported 4.3 million barrels of oil per day. And today, Russia, can maybe expect interruptions on the order, unprecedented order that Adam Smith was just describing. But that means every day Russia is potentially poised to export hundreds of millions of dollars in oil. And the question will be, do Western governments eventually realize that just as we're causing disruption, we're allowing the Russians to refill their coffers? And so does something need to be done to basically ratchet up the pressure? The danger in even thinking about that is the potential knock-on harm that could cause to our own economies. And, given the importance of things like the price at the pump, that's been something that Western leaders have been unwilling to entertain in past years. But given what we're watching on television, I think there will be pressure on them to do something in the weeks ahead as this war gets worse.
And as I hear all of you talking about weeks and even months, I'm going to come back to you, Doug Lute. Is the Ukrainian military prepared to hold on? For the Ukrainian people, are they prepared to hold on for the weeks and even months that I hear the three of you saying it's going to take for some of these heavy sanctions and other supportive moves by the West toward Ukraine to take effect?
Well, look, as this extends into weeks and months, the key question here, the key variable will be logistics. First of all, we heard from Samantha Power, the logistics of the humanitarian relief effort, both in Poland and other neighboring states, but also in Western Ukraine itself. And then the logistics of the military fight. The Ukrainian military will not be able to sustain itself. We have to resupply anti-armored weapon systems, anti-air weapon systems, rations, medical supplies, and so forth. And that resupply effort will be launched largely on the same routes that Nick Schifrin described. That is, the routes going out of Poland in particular, but Slovakia, Romania as well, back in through Western Ukraine and into the heartland. So logistics are going to be key here, Judy.
And staying with you, Doug Lute, is the West prepared to do that down the road? What's your sense?
I think the West is beginning to marshal that kind of major logistics effort. But these are, again, the very early days in that effort. And all the security assistance, the different weaponry and supplies and so forth that have been offered by national governments across the NATO alliance and beyond have to be assembled, they have to be transported, and they have to get into the hands of the right people in Ukraine. That is a major logistics problem.
So much to think about here. We thank the three of you for helping us understand where we are. Doug Lute, Andrew Weiss, Adam Smith, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I mean, conservatives that some might have said, oh, they're not as invested. They have a more isolationist kind of view of things. And Democrats as well that may have been perceived as isolationist. I'm feeling like everybody's at the table right now. Nobody can stand seeing these atrocities. Everybody wants to do something to be able to help. The reality is they may actually need to be doing something to help in terms of their own budgets that they're allocating for at home, because I think that we are all going to feel this in some way, shape, or form, not just what we're seeing on the TV screens, Leland, but in terms of our household budget management. For sure, it's going to hit Americans' pocketbooks. How willing are they to deal with this? I actually think Americans are pretty willing. I think we are just an incredible people. We believe in freedom. Freedom needs to win, so people will put up with it. But when it's all said and done, and look, it's not the time nor place, right, to be pointing a ton of fingers at lawmakers, but when it's all said and done, I think a lot of people might be questioning how we got here in the first place. And at that point, when they go to the voting booths, there will be some of that frustration perhaps taken out there. But in the interim, I think it's just the reality, right, of what we're going to have to deal with, whether or not somebody's willing to. I think for the most part, they want to do what's right for the world, what's right for Ukraine. Yet it's going to hurt every single one of us and every family here in America.
Yeah. No, and I know the way you're speaking and what you're, the sort of the idea and the sentiment you're sharing comes from the sources that you continue to talk to that give you, that kind of give us a sense of where the economy is headed. Trish, thank you very much. We appreciate it. 25 and a half hours until... All right.
Appreciate your time. And next, a question that pretty much everyone's asking now with fear around the world about where this is going to go. What is Putin thinking? Because what he did isn't rational, and what he's talking about doing isn't rational, and those who know him say he's more isolated and more paranoid and more reckless. So what is going on? And that's just mentioned the western border. And it's a pretty terrifying thing what he just said, because that western border is the only way people are getting out. You see these images? This is what we saw. And we could show you the hellish journey that now it's going to be millions of Ukrainians are taking to get out of the country. So in an hour and 10 minutes, we went about 1/2 of 1 mile. So that means, obviously, you do the math, the distance to the border, it would take us 57 hours to get there at the pace we're going now.
So we for Will Smith.
I know, it's bad, it's bad.
Plus, the star that made Lady Gaga break down, and the celeb couple.
Now your sensor's been down throughout the day so far, but temperatures will be falling back to the upper 20s by midnight as those clouds stick around as well. And in Pierre, some more clouds for you too, but you're in the mid-50s, and you'll only be falling back to the 30s later on tonight as well. There will be some cooler weather returning soon, and we'll talk about that coming up.
Recreational marijuana won't be legal anytime soon in the state after lawmakers voted down Senate Bill 3 today. We'll take a look at what happened and the next steps the commodity has to go through before potentially becoming legal.
But first, with the warm temperatures, that means that there's more time outside, but it also means that there are more hazards on the road. Pothole season really upon us. Those stories and more are coming up on Dakota News Now at 6:30.
This is Dakota News Now.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sam Wright.
I'm Andrea Anderson. The warmer weather these last few days has thawed and melted a lot of the ice on the roads.
But as we head into March and the temperatures frequently go above and below freezing, we'll see a different kind of driving hazard. John Gaskin is joining us with our top story here at 6:30.
It's that time of the year again. Pothole season.
Oh, they're everywhere. They're all over. You go down any side of town, you're gonna run into a pothole at least one street. They're not small little bumps. They're big holes. Yeah, they're bad.
How frustrating does it get?
Frustrating. It's frustrating. I'm hoping at some point they're gonna go around and start filling all of them. But I mean, in my eyes, seeing how it's gone, I mean, I think they have better priorities, quote unquote.
Sioux Falls Street Operations Manager Dustin Hanson hears that a lot. He says his team has fielded over 14,000 requests to fill potholes the last 3 years and have filled far more than that.
Typically, during a week, we've tried to have 4 to 6 crews out, just depending on what the requests are. And those crews will consist of 3 to 4 people on each crew.
Hanson says the warmer winter weather of the last 3 years has meant more time to fill potholes before the freeze and thaw effect of March and April really roughs up the streets.
For our team, it's one of the highest priorities for the maintenance division.
Okay.
Yep.
Why is that?
Because we don't want damaged people's cars. We want smooth riding roads.
One way you could help the potholes get fixed sooner is by letting the city know about them. Call the pothole hotline or visit siouxfalls.org/pothole. In Sioux Falls, John Gaskins, Dakota News Now.
Time to make a call to our weather hotline with meteorologist Avocado.
Already seeing species go extinct.
Troops and trucks was actually 17 miles long. Well, now Maxar says they've reevaluated the images and it's 40 miles long. So a lot of Russian forces headed to this capital city, and it comes amid reports of intense shelling in the second largest Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. We will continue to follow this story throughout the night, but again, the latest here on the ground in the Ukrainian capital, air raid sirens sounding once again as people across the city await in bomb shelters. Jesse?
All right, thank you so much, Trey. As we monitor that situation in Kyiv, reporters on the ground are dealing with the situation firsthand. Joining me now is Nastya S., local Kyiv reporter and journalist at Independent Media. Nastya, what are you seeing there right now?
Hello, now it's 2 a.m. in the morning in Kyiv. I am in my apartment. It's a 24th floor, and now it's quiet. But a few hours ago, it was a riot in Kyiv, and it was shelling actually 7 kilometers from this place where I am. And what we saw today in Kyiv, it's burning cars around the streets, some of them with dead bodies already, because it was some battles during the last night and night before. And also some buildings are under shelling also. And we hear also some bombs on the west-north part of Kyiv, and yeah, we know the information that Russian troops came to came to Kyiv, and they are closer and closer. And now the last information that Russian troops come in and want to occupy Kherson. It's a city on the south part of Ukraine, near the Crimea.
Have you seen or heard reports of Russian soldiers inside the capital engaging in gun battles with civilians or Ukrainian military forces?
Actually, it were battles more with territorial defense and with the Ukrainian army. For example, last night, but it's very dangerous for civilians, and we can't, even journalists, we can't go there. It's a commandant time, and if it is, you can't go anywhere except bomb shelters. In my case, it's a parking, underground parking in my house, and many people are here, but we can't go in some streets just to shelter and go back to our flats. And but yes, we saw this burning cars, like what was happened after this fighting. But today, everything was more or less quiet.
All right.
With this.
Thanks, Nastya. We appreciate it. Be safe. Vladimir Putin's been threatening to invade Ukraine, and he did that. So, what does he want now? What's his end goal? Will he stop with Ukraine or move to Poland or the Baltics? My next guest predicted that Putin would invade Ukraine in his book, The Next 100 Years. Joining me now is George Friedman, founder and chairman of Geopolitical Futures. George, if you look at the map of Europe, it's not just going to stop at Ukraine. From what we've heard from Vladimir Putin's speech, from everything he said about reestablishing the empire, it's got to go towards the Baltic Sea. It's got to go south towards the Black Sea. What moves do you see him making next, and why, in your opinion?
Well, first, we have to recognize that he's made a massive failure, and it wasn't in Ukraine. He wanted to split NATO. He was hoping that Germans, needing Russian fuel, having trade relations with Russia, would not participate, that Europe would fragment, and therefore that any kind of resistance wouldn't emerge. That would give them tremendous room for maneuver. What happened was exactly the opposite. Germany at first appeared to be talking quietly about not doing anything. Internally, the public demanded that they join the action. It is now part of the sanctions on Russia. It is now definitely giving weapons. It is involved. Now NATO is united as it hasn't been since the 1980s. It is united in terms of military cooperation. It is united in terms of the sanctions. The sanctions on Russia are massive. Japan has joined it, and every country has joined it. And Russia's ability to withstand this is questionable. So right now, we see three things. First, he failed in splitting NATO completely. Second, he has not succeeded in Kiev or Ukraine. He has not done that. And third, he has a massive set of sanctions on him that involves even the Germans, whom he was counting on to split the ticket. So you see why he might start babbling about nuclear weapons. He's massively lost in just a few days. He's massively lost in just a few minutes, a few days, the advantage he thought he had. So now he's desperately thinking about what to do. But all the long-term plans will have gone away because NATO is back, very dangerous from his point of view. Sanctions are on top of him, and he doesn't know his next move.
So do you think he's even more dangerous now? He's a wounded animal. He's cornered. That's why you hear him talking about nuclear retaliation. Do you think we should even be more nervous about him doing God knows what?
The real question is, how secure is his position? He's led this country into disaster. And we don't have any clear idea of how they replace Putin or anything like that. But the problem of nuclear war, while we've never had one, is in a nuclear war, your children die, your grandchildren die, the people you love. It's not far away like Ukraine is for many Americans. And the people in Russia know that too. So the issue is how much control do the Russians have on Putin? We're turning to the question of the Putin tried something, failed, has no exit. Is there any force inside of the Russian elite that'll stop him? One of them is the oligarchs. They're losing a huge amount of money. They met with him yesterday. What they said, I don't know. But the real issue here, I think, is not Putin. We have to start taking our eyes off of Putin and start talking about the people around him that are risking an enormous amount for his ego.
Yeah, coup would be the best scenario. And God, do I pray that happens. That would save a lot of lives. George Friedman, thank you so much.
For skin that works as hard as you do.
Threat to the whole world.
We are afraid of the nuclear missiles. We want the sky over Ukraine to be closed by NATO forces.
And when you talk to a lot of people here at Leland, everyone is exhausted, tired, humbled, thankful to be here. But you ask this one particular question, what do you think of Vladimir Putin? That is a question that elicits anger and fear. And what we've heard from everyone here is that nobody thought that Vladimir Putin would actually go through with an invasion. Nobody thought that he was capable of more than political posturing. What they say now is that he is prepared to back up his threats with action, as you have seen so far in Ukraine. Leland?
Yeah, what else do we not think he is capable of that he is now? Robert Sherman, thank you very much. The Pentagon spoke exactly to that issue. Not only are things not going the way the Ukrainians thought, or for that matter, the Americans thought, things are definitely not going the way the Russians thought. Take a listen.
We believe that based on what we know of what their plans were, that they are behind schedule, that they have faced a stiffer resistance.
Dmitry Alperovich is one of the foremost experts on Vladimir Putin and Russian thinking. Is Vladimir Putin sitting there surprised at the world's reaction, the Ukrainian resistance, the flooding the zone of weapons?
I think he absolutely is. He expected the Ukrainians to fold. That's very clear because he has not even brought most of the Russian army.
How does the master chess player miscalculate?
He thought that these guys did not want Zelenskyy. Zelenskyy was pretty unpopular before this invasion, and that he could roll into Kiev with literally 10 armored vehicles and they would give up. Obviously, that backfired badly.
All right. You put a tiger in a corner, he's going to fight his way out. when the Tiger has nuclear weapons, that's got other implications.
Well, he's threatening the use of nuclear weapons. He's put it on an elevated state of alert, but I don't think he's going to use it. This is posturing on his part. He's warning the West, do not get involved in this war or else.
Well, he's warning or else, but the U.S. is getting involved in the war. You think about the amount of weapons that the West is now sending to the Ukrainians. It's enough to kill a whole lot of Russians. Vladimir Putin has now said that he will hold Western nations responsible for dead Russians by those weapons. How does this not escalate?
I think that is a real risk. I don't think it'll get nuclear, but the fact that a kinetic escalation is possible should be very worrisome, particularly those planes that the Europeans are now providing to the Ukrainians. If they're going to be flying from Poland, as some of the reporting suggests, that gives Russia an opportunity to potentially target Poland's air bases.
Yeah,
that is very dangerous.
Yeah, no, it's this idea just in the past couple of minutes. I'm glad you had you on because I wanted you to translate some of the Russian reporting and Polish reporting that the Poles and the Slovaks are going to give the Ukrainians airplanes and give them bases to fly out of their country to take on the Russians. That would really change things because it opens up NATO bases for attack by the Russians. Wanted to point this out to you in terms of the pressure on Vladimir Putin. Russian oligarchs now are moving yachts. Russian oligarchs move yachts as U.S. looks to hunt down and freeze assets. It's sort of a minor point, but how much control or pressure can Vladimir Putin's circle of billionaires around him put on Putin and say, you're ruining all of our lives, end this?
I don't think the billionaires themselves are able to put any pressure. They dance to Putin's tune. But who can put pressure is the military and the intelligence community. And by the way, they all are benefiting from the theft and the corruption that has occurred under his rule for the last 20 years. If they start putting pressure on him, that's when he loses his power base.
Well, the Swiss are starting to freeze their bank accounts, so that's something. Dimitri, thank you very much. We appreciate it. You've been phenomenal over the past couple of weeks to talk to us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, more soon there. All right, how does President Biden change the narrative? George will next on what will President Biden say and what does it mean for the country?
And that's what helps make PBS NewsHour and all of the news.
Party. It's a lot of crazy and a little conservative, right? And so you did hear some conservative themes, but they were minimal. They were drowned out by the way Donald Trump has kind of smashed the GOP orthodoxy of the past and recast the party and the movement in his image. And so CPAC is kind of a trailing indicator to all things Donald Trump. And even the speakers you see have to fit within that Trump lane or they're not invited. CPAC is not a conservative confest anymore. In fact, I think Matt Schlapp, the CPAC director, has said they don't even call themselves conservatives anymore, and I think the world would agree.
The reason I say, I always enjoy speaking to you. The reason I say you're the wrong guy to talk about this is because you were never in that weird space. I remember a time when Republicans were about national security and global security and the threat that the Soviet Union posed and the threat that post-Soviet Russia posed. How does that get lost? I entirely understand that there are people who just don't want to see any success from Joe Biden whatsoever, but how does the idea that an expansionist Russia is talking about nuclear weaponry get lost on some Republicans?
Look, we're now 10 years into this refashioning of the GOP, and we can talk about ideology, we can talk about cult of personality. I think the greatest casualty of the last 10 years for the GOP is that it's no longer a serious party. And what I mean by that is, look, a serious party and a serious Congress, honestly, regardless of Republican or Democratic, in the initial days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine would have said in concert together that Congress stands ready to provide Joe Biden and the Western Alliance every resource that is needed to stop the aggression we're seeing from Russia. That's it. We're here to do our job to provide resources to protect the security of the world. That's not today's Republican Party. It is no longer a serious party, and I say that with a lot of lament, not simply conjecture.
There's some hope. Marco Rubio tweeted today, and he's pretty predictable on this stuff, but he said, growing signs Putin has ordered a medieval siege of Kyiv, cut a city of millions off from food, fuel, power, communication, and supplies, and then bomb and starve the government into submission. We need to start thinking about what we can and are willing to do to prevent such a barbaric crime. Now, again, this is in keeping with generally speaking, Marco Rubio's hawkish thinking about military affairs. Does he have enough sway? Are there enough Republicans? Are we going to see tomorrow night? Are we going to see Republicans applaud President Biden for putting together this coalition to go after Russia?
No, because I will also point out Marco Rubio just said he's not even going to attend tomorrow night over protests over the COVID testing requirements, which also suggests that a petty grievance between one of the leaders of Senate Intel and the President of the United States is going to interfere with such a coalition. I think the unity you will see from Republicans tomorrow is around support for Ukraine, but not support for Joe Biden. And that's going to be the nuance. When Joe Biden says to the world tomorrow night, the people of America stand with Ukraine, you'll see almost unanimous applause. But when he asks for a coalition of Republicans and Democrats to stand with Joe Biden as the leader among this coalition of the West, or one of the leaders, that's where you'll see the public dissent that is undermining the authority of the United States on the world stage.
And yet the stuff that Joe Biden has done in the last couple of months having to do with Ukraine is reminiscent of George H.W. Bush. It's reminiscent of other American presidents who have said, in the face of a global threat, America will take a leadership role. He does not seem either in polling or in the Republican Party for the moment to be getting any credit for that.
No, and I think you will see quietly, right? Nobody, even in the Republican Party that's responsible, wants to give Joe Biden credit because they're all political narcissists. But I think you will see Congress, a number of leading Republicans, respond affirmatively to Biden's request for, I believe, $7 billion in new assistance to Ukraine, both military and non-military. I think the interesting question, though, and this is where, if we truly had a serious conversation about this, is it time for the United States and the West to establish and expand a more permanent presence in places like Poland? And understand, we have standing installations in Germany, Japan, other places around the world. I'm not suggesting armed conflict with the Russians. But what we were unwilling to do in Ukraine, in large part because they're not a NATO member, are we willing to do to protect NATO, the eastern flank of NATO? I think we need to do that.
Well, the Poles and the Lithuanians in particular would be very interested in that. They are truly concerned that an expansionist Russia will roll into a NATO country. And even if they're NATO members, they're worried it'll happen. David, good to see you. You know the truth. I always enjoy talking to you, so I am very pleased that you would join me tonight with your analysis and your experience. David Jolly. All right, from comedian to president.
Health issues. Neurophysiological health issues. Look, I know nobody wants to armchair psychology here, but it's pretty significant that you would hear that from someone like Senator Rubio, who is, getting a lot of classified briefings and on the Intelligence Committee.
Yeah, so I don't, I'm not a medical doctor. I have a political science degree, doctorate. But what that sounds like is something like Parkinson's, maybe. Now, what that would tell me is not that he's suffering in terms of his judgment per se because of the physical issue. It's more that he might feel like he doesn't have that much time as the leader of Russia, which gets back to why he's doing this whole thing, why he's doing it now. The idea that he needs to leave his mark on history, maybe because he feels like his time leading the country isn't that long.
Oh. Evelyn, thank you.
Thanks, Aaron.
And next, the Russian oligarchs. We've talked a lot about them on this show, right? That they're the billionaires who are inextricably tied with Putin. And they are now, finally, for the first time, turning on him. And tonight, breaking news on another multi-billionaire who has turned. And the youngest victims of Putin's invasion, the children, fleeing their country, not knowing if they will be able to return.
Sheldon, good to see you. I can see you're upset, but when we said ditch the shells, we were talking about pistachios, not you.
Oh, you mean these pistachios? Oh, no, you look upset. You okay, John?
Can we get some arugula, please?
We capture lots of data. With Fiverr, we were able to find the right software developer to help gather all that data and put it into the right system. I was able to save time and money and spend more time growing my business.
Transform your business today. Fiverr.
So hot.
Hi. Who are you?
I'm Tomorrow. Sweaty sleepers aren't too crazy about me. Casper. It's a Casper snow mattress. A new cooling collection from Casper.
Do you think any of us will look back in our lives and regret the things we didn't buy?
Or the places we didn't go.
We need to reduce plastic waste in the environment.
That's why at America's beverage companies,
our bottles are made to be remade.
Not all plastic is the same.
We're carefully designing our bottles to be 100% recyclable, including the caps.
They're collected and separated from other plastics,
So they can be turned back into material that we use to make new bottles.
That completes the circle and reduces plastic waste.
Please help us get every bottle back.
Never be afraid of your strength, because your body is capable of amazing things. The one they said you shouldn't have, the one driven by a power they can't see. Own your strength and see how far it takes you. Tono, be your strongest.
Two Russian oligarchs breaking ranks with Vladimir Putin. Billionaires Oleg Deripaska and Mikhail Flippin publicly criticizing Putin's invasion of Ukraine, calling for an end to the war. Deripaska is a close ally of Putin's, also calling for, quote, clarifications and intelligible comments on Russia's economic crisis brought on by crippling sanctions from the U.S. and others. And frankly, not even by sanctions. It's a run of Russians on Russian banks. What's happening is an internal, complete crumbling of the economy and civil society in Russia. And now another oligarch is turning on Putin, according to Forbes. Out front now, Louisa Kroll. She is the executive editor at Forbes. And Louisa, I'm really glad to have you back. I know you've done so much on this, and you have more news on this unprecedented move by oligarchs to denounce Putin.
We do. Friedman's notification actually came in a letter to employees that he never meant to make public. And then Deripaska spoke. And then today, Alexei Mordashov, who's one of the richest Russians, came out and again spoke against the war and was very clear that the bloodshed has to stop. And now we've counted up to 8 billionaires who have spoken publicly, which is really unprecedented. This has never happened before, and really is hopefully a sign of them standing up to him and rallying together to hopefully figure out a way to stop Putin.
Well, it's pretty incredible because, you know, once they've said it publicly, you can't go back, right? These things can't be unsaid. They can't be forgiven. If he survives in power, I mean, it's a hugely significant thing, just to make that point. And then you've got the economy in free fall, as I mentioned, Louisa, right? Sanctions are part of it, but it's also regular Russians sort of responding with shock and awe to what's happening. They're not even able to have their market open, going to be closed for the second day in a row. The U.S. has targeted Russia's central bank. Russians are lining up at ATMs, and I want to say the big difference between the Russians and the Ukrainians is the Russians are lining up and trying to cash out all their money and rubles and turn them into dollars. And the Ukrainians are lining up to get out Ukrainian money because they actually trust their own money, which I think is a huge statement. Do you think it could get even worse in Russia?
I mean, I think there are reports that the economy could completely collapse. I think that they have every reason to be very worried about what's going on. And as you talked about earlier in the show about Putin's mental health, he's really somewhat unhinged. So you don't really know what he's going to do or what lengths he's willing to go to push the economy to its brink.
All right, Louisa, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Lisa's the executive editor at Forbes. They have done so much fantastic work on the oligarchs. And next, the toll Putin's war is having on the most vulnerable, the children of Ukraine.
Do your eyes bother you? My eyes feel like a combo of stress, dry, and sandpaper. Dry paper? Luckily, there's BioTrue Hydration Boost Eye Drops. BioTrue uses naturally inspired ingredients and no preservatives. Try BioTrue.
Do you think any of us will look back in our lives and regret the things we didn't buy? Or the places we didn't go?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
It was almost never about food. I think it was about Tony learning how to be a better person.
He meant so much to so many people.
Had enough? No. Arthritis. Here. Aspirin arthritis. Huh. Full prescription strength. Reduces inflammation. Thank the gods. Don't thank them too soon.
Kick pain in the Aspirin.
Icy hot.
Planes near the center of the state to tell you.
How did that play into this?
Well, look, I mean, the big takeaway from that, the big takeaway from Russiagate is what I've been saying for 5 years. I've been covering that story since we first started to understand what was happening. And I said from the beginning, this is not simply a political scandal. No matter what you think about Donald Trump, we are watching a national security disaster unfold, and that's what we have right now. Right? Look at what's happened. We have the national security advisor to the President of the United States, who was on the Hillary Clinton campaign and who was pushing Russiagate about Vladimir Putin. We have people...
And he has transformed into a...
Tomorrow night to see if Joe Biden blames inflation on...
The character that he's showing right here is very...
He says, look, we have problems. It's always possible to treat the American people as adults. 1975, most presidents come out and say the State of the Union is splendid and I'm the reason why. 1975, Gerald Ford, we'd had a president resign, helicopters were lifting off the roofs of Saigon, stagflation was setting in the 70s. Gerald Ford came out, looked the American people in the eye and said the State of the Union is not good.
And he promptly lost re-election.
Barely, but he did treat the American people as adults. It's worth trying.
It is worth trying. It would be an unusual thing. I don't think anybody's done it since 1975 for obvious political reasons. You made a good point about what to...
Taking AK-47s and saying, well, I've never fired one before, but I'm going to now.
Yeah.
These women who are filling bottles of Molotov cocktails and saying, I'll throw one out my window down an armored personnel carrier. You cannot beat this attitude.
Yeah.
And granted, we may have to get a logistics chain on them, tail on them to help them. But how do you beat somebody that cannot be tramped down, whose attitude cannot be broken?
You told us this is how it was going to go down. It's amazing. Malcolm, thanks again for being with us. Malcolm Nance, as always. Hey, Joy is back tomorrow night for the readout at 7, which is followed by special coverage of President Biden's State of the Union address at 8 p.m. All In with Chris Hayes begins right now.
All in. The Western world unites against Putin as the Russian assault on Ukraine continues.
These are the most significant financial sanctions that have been used in modern history.
Tonight, the run on the banks in Russia, the massive protests against the invasion across the world, and the latest on the ground in Ukraine. Plus, the return of a decades-old threat as Putin declares a nuclear alert.
Happening, and yet all of it is your fault. So that's a slanderous lie. In this country, virtually everyone understands that the invasion of Ukraine is bad. It's bad for us and for the world, and Vladimir Putin is bad too. So effectively in America, those are settled facts. We can stop debating them. The question is, what do we do next? Vladimir Putin's badness doesn't absolve us of our responsibility to think clearly about how to protect this country and the rest of the free world in that order. In fact, Putin's badness makes wise decision-making in the United States more important than ever, and yet at the same time, it makes wise decision-making harder to achieve. It's not easy to see the long...
Negotiations took place with the shelling and bombing of our territory on the background. Shelling of our cities. Synchronization of the shelling with the negotiations was obvious. I think that with this simple-minded method, Russia is trying to pressurize. Do not lose time. We do not accept these tactics.
That said, they may only escalate from here, as have and apparently as will economic sanctions on Russia, which have begun hammering the lives not just of oligarchs but ordinary Russians as well. Vladimir Putin's rhetoric has also escalated, with his order this weekend raising Russia's nuclear alert posture. And again, according to the UN, the war has already produced more than 500,000 refugees. As only CNN can, we've got correspondents throughout the country, throughout the region. CNN Chief International Correspondent Clarissa Ward is in Kyiv tonight for us. CNN contributor Jill Doherty is in Moscow. CNN Sarah Seidner in Poland, just across Ukraine's western border, where refugees are streaming out. CNN's Fred Pleitgen is on the Russian side of Ukraine's northeastern border, where Russian troops have been going in. CNN's Nick Payton-Walsh is on the Black Sea in Odessa. And here with me, CNN Chief National Security Correspondent Jim Sciutto, who starts us out with a look at the big picture.
Ukrainian forces have so far managed to hold on to the capital, Kyiv, defying U.S. intelligence assessments, despite the increasing intensity of the Russian onslaught. But U.S. officials are now warning that Russia could soon increase the intensity of their attack.
They have suffered setbacks, but I don't think we can just assume that they're going to stay set back.
Satellite images show a Russian military convoy getting closer to Kyiv from the north. The head of the convoy most recently observed at an airport fewer than 20 miles from the city center. As the Ukrainians try to hold off the Russian advance across the country, the U.S. and its allies are keeping up the pressure on the financial front, sanctioning Russia's central bank, essentially cutting off Vladimir Putin's ability to support the Russian ruble, which fell as much as 30% on Monday.
These actions will severely impact Putin's inner circle, impede the Kremlin's use of its international reserves, and limit its ability to fund ongoing destabilizing activities.
And in an historic move, even Switzerland, long a bastion of neutrality, has decided to match the European Union's sanctions on Russia.
L'attaque de la Russie contre l'Ukraine.
Russia's attack against Ukraine is unacceptable with regards to international law, unacceptable politically speaking, and unacceptable from a moral point of view.
As the war continues to rage, Russia has come to the negotiating table with Ukraine. Ukraine says their primary aim is a ceasefire and cessation of hostilities. Russia says the two sides found points where they could make progress. A second round of talks will take place in the coming days, though Ukrainian President Zelenskyy sounded pessimistic before the talks began.
I don't really believe in the result of this meeting, but let them try. So then later on, no citizen of Ukraine would have any doubt that I, the president, did not try to stop the war when I had a chance.
Today, the U.S. made a different kind of move on the diplomatic front, expelling 12 Russian diplomats from the UN, accusing them of espionage activities, but noting this process had been going on for several months. CNN has reached out to the State Department for comment. Military aid is still pouring into Ukraine, the Biden administration approving another $350 million of security assistance over the weekend. And even Sweden, a non-NATO member, announced they'd be sending 5,000 anti-tank weapons, 5,000 helmets, 5,000 body shields, and 135,000 field rations.
We're going to continue to provide security assistance to Ukrainian armed forces. The Ukrainians have been effective at using these weapons and these systems, and at resisting and pushing back Russian forces.
Germany finally announced it would send weapons to Ukraine as well, and has said it will hike its own defense spending in light of Russia's continued aggression.
President Putin
should not underestimate our determination to defend every square meter of our alliance's territory together with our allies.
Tonight, the latest satellite images show the sheer immensity, Anderson, of that Russian force now making its way from the north towards Kyiv. It stretches 40 miles long. Imagine that from a point about 17 miles north of the city, heading north from there. It's a combination of tanks, armored personnel carriers, supply vehicles, towed howitzers. That's the force that U.S. intelligence believes Russia is going to attempt to surround, encircle the capital, and then attempt from there really to take over the country.
It's also extraordinary. You have Sweden supplying weapons now, Germany, a huge reversal of German policy to actually now supply weapons. The question, I guess, is can they get here in time, and can they get to the places where they're needed?
My understanding.
You will support a war that could very easily turn into a nuclear conflict. Again, this is moral blackmail. No one in America takes pride at the sight, feels anything but revulsion at the sight of Russian troops within Ukraine. It's wrong, it's destabilizing to the world. It is, in fact, against our values. But how we respond is the question. Thoughtfully has to be the answer, unless we're prepared to risk massive consequences.
Of stark reality in terms of the limits to Russian military might and power. And I am sure that a lot of these Russian troops that have gone into Ukraine didn't know where they were going. And so I think, as you point out, we now are in this escalatory spiral, which is quite worrisome because Putin, in my mind, does not have the psychological makeup to admit that he was wrong or to reverse course. And so therefore, is he going to double down and become even more reckless if he sees that his intent has not been fulfilled? And therefore, the only way he's going to survive this politically, he believes, is to lash out more. But I do not see Putin ever recovering from this. I don't believe that Russia is going to recover from this unless Putin is no longer on the political scene in Moscow.
Let's talk about the first point, just to start with, the sort of strategic, or what appears to be at this moment, we don't know, a kind of strategic miscalculation. I mean, when you look back, there have been, in some ways, when you take a step back, you can recognize a variety of sort of transgressions from Putin's Russia that have basically, they've gotten away with. I mean, they've assassinated dissidents. They've deployed chemical weapons on, British soil against a former spy in Sergei Skripal. They have co-opted and then annexed Crimea. They have interfered in an American election in 2016. I guess from an intelligence standpoint, what does it say to you about how U.S. policymakers are modeling the person on the other side of this conflict, that this apparent miscalculation, something so sort of egregious and transgressive, has been made about what it means in the next sort of round of this?
Well, I think the terms unhinged and off the rails and other types of descriptions of Putin are now quite, I think, clear to a lot of people that he may, in fact, have this very warped and distorted prism of the world. And therefore, earlier miscalculations about going into Ukraine in this full invasion, I think, are going to be followed by additional desperate attempts to try to recover from these setbacks that he's seeing right now. But I think this is just going to get worse for him. I'm sure that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of Russian soldiers who have been captured. This is going to start to resonate back home in a very, very, I think, profound and negative way for him. And so therefore, I think U.S. intelligence officials are seeing Putin as somebody who, badly miscalculated, doesn't have good options going forward, and therefore is going to be grasping at whatever options he believes are going to provide him some semblance of relief from what he sees as this international isolation and the military setbacks that he's facing in Ukraine. The fact that the Russian military machine is being attacked by the Ukrainian military so effectively, I think really embarrasses him. And I'm sure he's blaming his senior intelligence and military officials. And that's why I believe that I think U.S. intelligence right now is looking at whether or not there are fractures and fissures within that Kremlin hierarchy that could, in fact, lead to some type of movement against Putin that is going to try to, again, get Russia off of this course of self-destruction.
One of the worrying aspects, we'll talk about, I'm going to talk later in the program about the sort of nuclear situation, which of course hangs over all of this. But short of that, I mean, people that have covered the Russian intervention in Syria, as we have on this program, if you go back and you look at the 2 rounds of war in Chechnya and what was done, particularly the city of Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, I mean, just massive and indiscriminate artillery shelling, bombing of buildings, civilian strongholds. There's a real worry that we haven't actually seen anything like that yet from the Russians, thankfully, but that is a place that this may go. What do you think of that?
Well, I think he has to be mindful that unlike in Chechnya and what he did in places like Grozny, as well as in Syria, they didn't have the same type of international focus. Yeah. And the TV cameras that were rolling, the footage is just constant now. And it shows the destruction that is being done by the Russian military. And so therefore, I think he doesn't have the same type of immunity from this international opprobrium that he is now facing. And so previously, he never went in and tried to swallow whole a country. Chechnya is inside of Russia. Syria, he was invited in by President Assad. This is something that goes far beyond anything that he has tried in the past. And that's why I think it has brought this swift and very, very intense and robust international reaction, something apparently he was very unprepared for. And so therefore, I do not think he has good options at this point, which is what worries me. What might he opt to do, given the fact that he has